Now you know that feeling. A band that built your musical DNA just dropped their new single, and your first reaction isn't excitement, it's a little bit of dread, isn't it? Not because they can't write songs anymore, but you've seen too many legends walk into a studio and then come out with something that sounds like it was assembled on a spreadsheet. And that is the tension. These records feel like someone's trying to rewrite history while you're standing right there. Most icons from the 70s and 80s shouldn't release new music. Chasing streaming era relevance waters down the exact thing that made them matter. But I want to walk you through why. Now, artists face a real problem here. The industry tells them that silence is death. You don't put something out for 5 years, your catalogue sinks below the algorithm's sightline. Now, nobody at the label says this out loud, but the message is clear. Stay visible or become a museum piece. And that pressure isn't theoretical. A lot of artists are still working off publishing deals or royalty arrangements written in the 1970s. Contracts that never imagined a world where they would just stop. And there's no clause for retiring gracefully. The machine expects product. And streaming makes it much worse. The platform rewards volume and not legacy. And they want fresh hooks, tight runtimes, and tracks designed to survive the first 15 seconds. The algorithm doesn't care if you wrote Dreams or Born to Run. It cares whether your new single fits into the New Music Friday and whether the skip rate is really low. So, the temptation creeps in. You get a young producer involved and a rapper who's currently charting right now. And this move feels like survival. But what they usually do is alienate the only group who are guaranteed to show up, the core fan base who've been with them for 40 to 50 years. And the vocal production is where it really falls apart for me. The older the singer gets, the more the voice changes. Now that's not a flaw, that's a documented fact of life. But on these new records you can hear, the engineers are working against nature. They take 6 or 7 different vocal tracks, put it together, and then put pitch correction across everything. Every single phrase, every single harmony, and it's stacked to hide all the cracks, instead of letting the track breathe. And what you end up with is a vocal that sounds like the memory of the singer, but not the singer himself. But the weirdest part is that the fans bless them, they feed the cycle. Every time a legacy act announce something new, the forums just light up. Maybe this one will be good. Now that's the hope and that's the loyalty, and it keeps the whole thing spinning, even when the results keep disappointing. And then the artist hears that anticipation and thinks they're doing the right thing by delivering, but they're not asking the harder question. Whether delivering anything is actually the right move. Okay, so let's think of a rock arena band from say the early 80s with 4 or 5 guys who could still fill a stadium with just like 3 chords and a killer riff. Their new record lands and you put it on, but the problem is it sounds like they've just hired someone who did the last Dear Looper album. But that's not an exaggeration, it's got the same compression curves, the same stereo low end, and the same airless top end that's been brickwalled into a fine line. That raw live room energy that defined their classic work, like, you know, it sounds like a band playing in the same room, in the same space, is completely gone. And now everything is locked to the grid. The drums have been quantized to submission and the guitars sound like they come from a sample pack and not an amp. And then the singer comes in. Now this voice, the voice you know that used to sound like gravel and gasoline, rough and unpolished and unmistakable. But on the new record, they've been auto-tuned into something completely unrecognisable. Every bit of character's gone. The cracks, the grain, that iconic voice, everything you know them for is gone, and it's been sanded down until what's left could be absolutely anybody. And it's just basically an approximation of a guy that sung those anthems 40 years ago. And the lyrics don't help. The old songs were full of specific images, like a car, a street corner, a fight, a name, and things you can visually see in your mind. This new stuff is just wallpaper. Generic stuff about uplifting and rising and overcoming and shining. But these lines feel like they're written for a sync license, not because someone needed to say them. But the streaming numbers tell the real story. A splash in week 1 for the press cycle and pre-save campaign. But then the freefall. By the time we get to week 3, the album's buried under hundreds of new releases. Nobody saved the songs, nobody built a playlist around it, and nobody's coming back to this record. Unless you're a super fan. But when you play it back to back with their 82 classic, the one that still sounds alive, it doesn't even register as the same species. They've become 2 different bands with 2 different reasons for making music, but only one of them was honest. The major DPS designed their algorithms to push songs that fit into a narrow sonic template. The tight end is low, bright highs, 0 dynamic range, and everything is mastered loud enough to push for a phone speaker on a train. That's not a conspiracy, that's just math. The algorithm learns what people skip and what they let play, and songs with dynamic swings or quiet passages don't survive the first 10 seconds. So the template calcifies, and the A&R teams know this. Legacy acts get steered right into this mould. The conversation in the label meetings probably sounds pragmatic. We need something that slots into today's top hits. The vocal needs to be tighter. We can get you a producer who understands the current landscape, blah, 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 which then translate to make it sound like everything else. So you end up with a 70+ singer singing over trap hi-hats because an analytic dashboard said that most playlists have this sort of sound. But nobody stops and asks whether the track actually needs trap hi-hats. But the question isn't even on the table. The mix becomes the biggest casualty because a brick wall limiting it pushes everything to the front, so there's nowhere for the ear to rest. Guitars that used to breathe get flattened into a wall. Drum performances that had push and pull and tiny human fluctuations and timing and slightly off gets quantized to the grid. And sometimes even sample replaced until the groove is synthetic. And then the mastering engineer, they push up the loudness to match the rest of the new Friday music pack. And then by the time the track hits your speakers, the human touch has been lobotomized. But even when a legacy record starts with a strong idea, the mastering process often kills it. You can always just hear the ghost of something interesting underneath. A chord progression that might have landed, a melody that could have stuck. But it's all been processed in the same frequency as a Doja Cat single. You know, the old records, they've got mistakes in them, they've got bum notes, they've got mixing errors, and it made them worth returning to. But those mistakes have now been smoothed out like glass. Now, the psychology of this on both sides is brutal. You know, the artist worries about irrelevance, worries that the silence means they've been forgotten, worried kids won't know their name, and the fan sits there worried their hero is going to embarrass themselves in public. It's a standoff where both parties are anxious, and no one wants to say it out loud, but maybe this thing shouldn't exist at all. But occasionally someone gets it right, and that exception proves exactly how broken the rule is. David Bowie made Blackstar knowing the clock was running out. He didn't tell anyone publicly, but the people in the room understood. This was a record with no obligation to tour, no playlist strategy, no summer festival run to support it. It was just about the art. It was made in a small room with a live band and cameras rolling because he wanted the process documented. This is not a retirement project. This was someone who needed these songs to exist. And the production avoided every modern shortcut. Things like Donny McClaskin's saxophone was bleeding into the drum mics, and there was deliberate silence treated as an instrument, and arrangements that stretched past 7 minutes because the idea demanded it. There was no trend chasing anywhere, and here's the thing, it sounded futuristic anyway. Not because Bowie was chasing the sounds of 2016, because he was building from his own vocabulary, the harmonic language he built from the 1970s pushed into stranger territory, and you can't fake that kind of continuity. His voice was front and centre on every track, untreated in every way that mattered. You could hear the age, the cracks, the breath supports shifted, and those imperfections became the whole emotional engine of the record. A 70-year-old man singing about a Lazarus does not need a pitch correction. You need to hear the 70 years, and the production team understood this, and that vulnerability stays exposed. The lyrics confronted mortality without pretense or grandiosity. Look up here, I'm in heaven. No evasion, no uplift, just the thing itself. That directness made this album feel immediate rather than a nostalgia product. But the thing about the album is, you're not listening to a legend trying to remind you of his catalogue. You're listening to a human being reckoning with the end of that catalogue and the end of everything else. Now, the lesson isn't that aging artists need to die to make a great late record, but the clarity of purpose beats audience capture every time. Blackstar had no reason to exist, but it went deeper than any chart or streaming metric ever could. The songs needed to be written. That energy, that necessity, is what makes the record feel alive. You don't need a crossover moment or feature or anything like that. You just need to sound like yourself. Weathered, honest, still searching is more than enough. In fact, it's everything. Here's the thing, Bowie proved by accident that his clarity was rare. Most legacy acts don't have it, and without it, new albums just fail on their own terms. They do something worse, they erode how you remember their catalogue that mattered. Every average release just makes the old songs feel a little bit less urgent. The myth gets smaller, you hear a lifeless new single, and it bleeds backwards. The 1977 live album still hits, but something shifted in your brain. The invincibility is gone, and you've looked behind the curtain, and what's back there is a contents calendar. It's the damage that nobody measures, not chart positions, it's an eternal catalogue erosion, the slow dimming of a legacy that used to glow without effort. Fans keep the machine running because walking away would feel like betrayal. They gave us everything, the least we can do is show up. That's the line, but it's not loyalty. It's just sentimentality dressed up as support. Now, real loyalty will be telling artists the truth, that they don't need to prove anything. Their work is done. And that silence can be louder than any other forced follow-up that's a bit second rate. So what about the money? Well, for legacy acts, it doesn't come from the new album that no one gives a crap about. It comes from their back catalogue, the publishing and the syncs and the catalogue sales. And none of that requires any fresh product. The back half of Rumours and Back in Black earns more money in a year than the new single ever will in a lifetime. Now, the financial pressure to create is largely the story the industry tells, because the industry needs content, but the artist doesn't need it. Now, a few artists release some records late into their career, David Bowie, Leonard Cohen and Johnny Cash in their Reuben years, but those records were made from a place of self-awareness that most didn't reach. They knew their voices and what would carry and what can't. They wrote towards their limits instead of pretending that their limits doesn't exist. Now, most artists can't do that work or won't do that work. The producers don't push them down there and the label doesn't ask for it. So you get yet another record that sounds like an expensive compromise. Honouring a legacy means sometimes protecting it from yourself. Lock the studio door, ignore the analytics, and let the catalogue stand. Silence isn't failure, it's the final act of taste. Now, the problem isn't that the artists got older, it's that they started auditioning for a sound that never belonged to them in the first place. Now, before you hit play on a legacy act's new single, ask yourself one hard question. Would you still care about the song if it had a different name on the cover? And if the answer's no, the music told you everything you needed to know. Thanks so much for joining me on this one. I'm really pleased you come along with me for this journey. Let me know which legacy acts you think should stop. Do you think there's any bands that should stop? Is there any bands that released a later album that you think is brilliant? I'd love to know that as well. Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know what album maybe I should listen to next. If I'm not, there might be one I've never heard before as well. If you'd like, subscribe. You massively help this channel and get more content out for you and do more things. I hate to beg you, but it's the nature of the beast. And let me know what I should look at next in the comments. Is there an album you want me to deep dive into, another subject about music you want me to look at? Hit us up and let us know. I've been Woody. I'll see you on the next one. Love and peace.